When we picture ancient Rome, we see marble columns, thundering legions, and the grand spectacle of the Colosseum. But beneath the veneer of imperial glory lies a darker, more brutal reality, a society built on the backs of millions of slaves. For the most vulnerable of all, the slave girl, life was a precarious existence. In the eyes of Roman law, she wasn't a person. She was a thing, a piece of property to be used, sold, or broken at her master's whim. It's a terrifying thought, absolute power with no legal recourse. But is that the entire story? Music shifts to a more inquisitive tone. What if I told you that even in this system of total ownership, there were lines that, over time, a master could not cross? Not because of a sudden wave of compassion, but for reasons far more complex and calculating. Today, we're exploring 5 surprising restrictions placed on the owners of slave girls in ancient Rome. A bustling Roman market, then shifting to a dimly lit brothel or tavern scene. In a world where a slave girl's body was considered her master's property, the most obvious and horrifying form of exploitation was forced prostitution. And for much of Roman history, this was tragically common. However, a fascinating legal wrinkle began to appear in sale contracts. Wealthy Romans, concerned with their family's honor and public standing, their dignities, started including a specific clause, any serva prostituta. Let the slave girl not be prostituted. This wasn't about protecting the girl's dignity. It was about protecting the master's reputation. To have a slave from your household working in a brothel was seen as a stain on your own character. It suggested you were either financially desperate or morally bankrupt. This contractual protection snowballed. By the 2nd century AD, under the famously organized Emperor Hadrian, it became a standard legal prohibition. A master could no longer sell his female slave to a brothel owner or pimp, and the Romans took this idea of shameful professions even further. In the later, more Christianized Byzantine Empire, the ban was extended to forcing a slave girl to perform on stage as an actress or musician in a tavern. To the Roman elite, these entertainers were seen as morally tainted, their work barely a step above prostitution. So, the first rule wasn't about her soul, but about his status. Visuals. Harsh, sun-bleached quarry or a vast agricultural field, latifundia, contrasted with a luxurious Roman villa interior. Not all slavery was created equal. At the bottom of this brutal hierarchy were the jobs that were essentially a death sentence, the mines, the quarries, and the vast agricultural estates known as a latifundia. Here, slaves were worked to the bone under the scorching sun, often chained, with shockingly high mortality rates. But what if your slave girl wasn't just a pair of hands? What if she was educated? A skilled weaver, a talented scribe, or a tutor for your children? In these cases, a master would be a fool to send her to the fields. It would be like using a surgeon's scalpel to chop wood. You don't just destroy the person, you destroy a valuable and often expensive asset. So, it became common for contract for skilled or educated slaves to explicitly forbid their assignment to this kind of brutal, life-destroying labor. This protection wasn't born from humanitarianism. It was pure economics. A master was simply protecting his investment from being damaged or, quite literally, worked to death. A Roman mosaic depicting wild animals in the arena, then an image of a temple or sanctuary. Host, this might be the most shocking one. While a master had the right to punish a slave, Roman society eventually began to flinch at the most extreme and public displays of cruelty. The first major step was the Lex Petronia in 67 AD. It forbade masters from throwing their slaves to wild beasts in the arena for sport without the permission of a magistrate. Think about that. They didn't ban it outright, but they made it a state-controlled affair. The goal was to stop a master from satisfying a personal, sadistic whim in a public spectacle. Then came Emperor Claudius. He noticed the cruel loophole masters were using. If a slave became old or sick, instead of paying for care, they would simply abandon them on an island in the Tiber River to die. Claudius decreed that any master who did this forfeited their ownership. If the slave recovered, they were free. The dial turned again under Emperor Hadrian, who outright forbade the killing of a slave without a just cause. And his successor, Antoninus Pius, created a radical new safeguard. A slave girl suffering from intolerable cruelty could flee to a temple or statue of the emperor and formally plead for protection. If a magistrate confirmed the abuse, the master didn't just get a warning. The slave was taken away and sold to a new owner, with a condition that she could never be returned to the original abuser. Now, let's be clear, this didn't end violence. Beatings, branding, and all manner of harsh punishments remained perfectly legal. But these laws show a slow, creeping recognition that wanton, excessive cruelty was a threat to social order and the state's authority. Number 4. The pragmatic family. Visuals. A depiction of a slave family, contubernum, working together in a household setting. In early Rome, a slave marriage, or contubernum, had no legal standing. A master could separate a husband from a wife or a mother from her child on a whim, selling them to different corners of the empire. It's a heartbreak that's almost impossible to imagine. But by the late empire, the state's perspective began to shift. The motivation, stability, and self-interest. Rulers and large estate owners realized that slave families were more productive. They were less likely to run away or rebel. And most importantly, they produced children, a new generation of slaves born into captivity, known as verni. These house-born slaves were considered more docile and loyal, as they had never known a life of freedom. This cold logic led to laws that, in some cases, forbade the separation of slave families during the sale of an estate. Under Emperor Diocletian, slave marriages were even briefly given official state recognition. While this was later reversed, it shows a stunning change in thinking. This wasn't about the sanctity of marriage. It was about creating a stable, self-perpetuating workforce, a more efficient system of human breeding. An elderly, frail slave contrasted with a master writing on a scroll. And finally, we come to a protection that sounds completely backwards. A slave girl could not be freed against her will. Why would anyone refuse freedom? Because sometimes freedom was a death sentence in disguise. Imagine a slave girl who had served a family her entire life. She is now old, sick, and can no longer work. A cold-hearted master, wanting to avoid the cost of feeding and housing her, might offer her freedom as a gift. In reality, he's just casting her out onto the streets to starve. This was known as weaponized manumission. To prevent this, especially for those who had voluntarily sold themselves into slavery for food and shelter, contract could stipulate that the master was obligated to care for them for life. Freedom could only be granted if the slave consented. It was a crucial shield against being discarded under the false pretense of benevolence. It ensured that the master's end of a bargain, lifelong security, was held up, host on screen, looking directly at the camera. Softer, more reflective music begins. So, what does this all tell us? These 5 restrictions paint a picture that is far more complex than just masters could do anything. But let's not mistake these rules for a sign of a humane society. The common thread running through all of them is not compassion. It's control, order, and economics. These laws were designed to protect the master's reputation, his financial assets, the stability of his workforce, and the public order of the state. They were guardrails on a system of absolute exploitation, not a dismantling of it. The fact that a law was needed to stop a man from throwing his servant to a lion tells you everything you need to know about the baseline of that society. So I leave you with this question. Were these laws a flicker of humanity in an otherwise brutal world? Or were they just a more sophisticated instruction manual for owning people? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspective. Upbeat outro music starts. And if you enjoy digging into the complex and often dark corners of history, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content just like this. Thanks for watching.